Evening. I got used to saying good evening rather than good morning. It's kind of a switch, but it's good. So we are in the last week of our series #Blessed, and we've been looking over the past couple months, looking at the Beatitudes from Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus says things like, "Blessed are those who mourn," or "Blessed are the peacemakers," or "Blessed are you when people persecute you," things like that. And if you missed any of those messages, they're on vv.church. You can watch them there, also the podcast. But today, I want to go take it a little bit past the Beatitudes. And in the verses following the Beatitudes, we're going to look at what it means as we have been blessed, what it means to be a blessing to others. Have you ever wondered what we are? Like, what is this group? What are we here for? Are we really just a social club kind of getting together, hanging out because we like each other, we all enjoy doing the same things, we all have kids around the same age, things like that? Are we just a social justice center? We're here to solve the world's problems and fix everything, make the government right, things like that? Well, what are we? Are we just a club? Are we just getting together to sing some songs and to feel good, get a little bit of warm, fuzzy feeling? What are we? And who we are, what we are, I think really defines how we interact with the world around us. And really there's a question of, what do we do with that? How do we interact with the world? Do we engage with the world? I'll give you a story. About a decade ago, which sounds weird to say, I was working at Sam's Club, and I was a cashier, and worked with lots of other people, but a few folks specifically. There was a Jehovah's Witness, a young lady I worked with, and also an atheist that I worked with. And we were regularly on the same schedule, so we had a lot of conversations and stuff. Now, there was this rule at Sam's Club, when I worked there, or the one I worked at, or whatever, that you can't talk about your faith, not like publicly. You can't evangelize, you can't try to proselytize, or however they say it. I'm not sure if this was a rule that was written down somewhere, like in the employee handbook, because nobody reads that anyway, right? Or if it was just kind of an unspoken thing, and you knew you were going to lose your job if you did. But my atheist buddy, he made sure that we were aware of that rule. Regardless, we had questions, we had conversations, and it was good, it was interesting. But moving forward, I had a manager who worked there, and I knew he was a Christian too. He and I had had some conversations about what church he attended, things like that. And at one point, he decided that he was going to go work somewhere else. So he gave his notice to Sam's Club. And I don't know if it was a 2 weeks notice, a month notice, or whatever. But in the last week of his time actually working at Sam's Club, all of a sudden, he was pursuing my atheist friend hardcore, evangelizing to no end. He was telling him all about, do you know about heaven? Do you know about hell? Do you want to go to heaven or do you want to go to hell? This is how you get to heaven. This is what's going to happen if you keep on going down the road you're going, and things like that. And on the one hand, I knew that he was evangelizing, and there was a part of his heart I knew that was in the right place. On the other hand, really seemed inauthentic. Because all of a sudden, in the last week, when there really wasn't anything for him to lose at his job, that's when he decided to care about the eternity of this young man. Is that how we're supposed to engage the world? What does the world say that we are? What does the world say how we're supposed to interact with them? They say sometimes that we're intolerant. Sometimes they might say that we are just a club. We're just a social gathering, and we should keep our time here just in this building. If we have faith, then we should keep it to ourselves. It should be something that's private, not public. It should be something that stays within our homes. So what do we do with that? If the world says we're to have an identity of kind of just this group, this club that feels good, makes each other feel good sometimes, what do we do with that? Well, in today's passage in Matthew 5, Jesus gives us two identities that I think answers this question, both of who he says we are and what that means for how we interact with the world around us. So in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 13, I'm going to be reading from a little bit different translation than what's in the seatbacks in front of you. You're welcome to follow along in there as well, but I'm going to have it up on the screen just for clarity as well. So starting in verse 13, Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt should lose its taste, how can it be made salty? It's no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled on by men. Now, if you're anything like me, when I hear the word salt, when I hear Jesus talking about you're the salt of the earth, the first thing that comes to my mind is using salt as a seasoning. Your steak has to taste good if it has salt on it, okay? Or have you ever had a batch of chocolate chip cookies without the salt? It's awful. It's gross. I don't understand how it's so bad, but without the salt, it's terrible. That's not what Jesus is talking about. They did use salt for seasoning back then, but the primary use for salt in the ancient times was as a preservative. They would take their fish, they would take their meat, and they would pack it in salt, like a lot of salt. I was looking up this week what it actually takes to preserve, and it's like a 10% solution of salt in order to actually make sure that you kill all the bad bacteria and yeast and stuff. So to get an idea, we do this when we make sauerkraut these days. If you've ever made sauerkraut, you put a tablespoon of salt in the gallon of water, mix it up, dissolve it, then put your chopped up cabbage in there. The good yeast grows, all the bad stuff, no. The good bacteria grows, all the bad yeast doesn't grow. Got to remember how that goes. So we use it as a preservative sometimes, but another example that I was thinking of just this week, probably on your drive here today, you experienced how we use salt to preserve lives on the roads or on the sidewalks outside, or as they're scattering salt to make sure we don't slip and break our neck, to make sure we can stay on the road. And salt is a preservative, and that's how Jesus' audience would have seen it. And so when Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, he's giving us our first identification as that of a preserver. You preserve. You are the salt of the earth, you preserve. And when you look at the history of the church, this has been part of their identity. This is something we have grabbed onto from the very beginning. The Roman Empire, the whole Greco-Roman culture, did not place the same value on life that, in general, we do today, although that's slipping too, honestly. But for instance, if a baby was born and it wasn't the right baby, maybe the right gender, maybe it wasn't healthy enough, or something like that, it would be tossed outside on the street to die, or thrown into the garbage heap, just to die. And that was normal, that was typical, that was expected. And then the church came along and they said, no, this human being has value. They were made in the image of God, they have value, and we're going to preserve their life, literally. And they would save those babies. Again, another common thing was for husbands to be cheating on their wives regularly, with men, with women, didn't really matter. And then the church came along and said, no, the marriage is sacred. You can't break this, and you can't treat your wives this way. And so they honored marriage in that way. And even in more general, women weren't treated well. They were looked down upon. They, in some cases, were less than slaves. And the church came along and again said, no, they were made in the image of God just like men, and let's treat them that way. And so the church, throughout our history, we've been preserving life. We are preservers. You are the salt of the earth. You are a preserver. The church started hospitals for the first time. The church started 100 out of the first 110 universities in America. Did you know that? The church, a Christian started the Red Cross in the early 1800s, 1833 or something like that. The church is a preserver. That's part of our identity. That's what it means to be the salt of the earth. The second identification that Jesus gives us starts in verse 14. It says, you are the light of the world. A city situated on a hill cannot be hidden, and no one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, but rather on a lampstand, and it gives light for all who are in the house. So I want to look real quick at two different words in this section, and then we'll go on. But the first is this word situated, a city situated on a hill. Your version might say set on a hill, or placed on a hill, or built on a hill. And what I really want you to get from this is that it's purposeful. It is a purposeful placement of the city. Someone didn't just randomly come along and start building and all this, and they're like, oh, look, I'm on top of a hill, and now there's a city here. That's not how it works. Jesus is saying, you are the light of the world, and a city set on a hill. Here's what I want you to get from this. Your position is purposeful. It is unique. and purposeful to who you are. God has placed you in a position where he wants you to be the light of the world. One caveat, if you're in a dangerous situation, get out. I think that's fair to say. I don't want you guys to misunderstand me. And also, God can take your position and he can call you to move somewhere else, the place that you work. Perhaps he wants you to change jobs or something like that. But in your work, in your families, in your relationships, in your friendships, God has put you there on purpose in order to be the light of the world. It's not some accident. The second word I want to look at is where it says, no one takes a lamp and puts it under a blanket. When it talks about putting it under a blanket, the word there means to keep something secret and safe. Hidden, not just like out of sight, out of mind, but hidden away from everybody else so that it can be mine and nobody else's. Why would someone do that? Why would someone take a lamp and hide it under a bowl? Why would someone want to keep it secret, keep it safe? I want to look, as an illustration, I want to actually look at Matthew 25, where Jesus tells a parable of the talents. And in Matthew 25:14 starts off, and this is about a master and his servants, and it's going to mention talents, and talents is just a unit of money. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. We're just going to kind of skip through because I want you guys to get kind of the big idea of it. But it says that he's talking about the kingdom of heaven, but he says it's just like a man going on a journey. He calls his own slaves and turned over his possessions to them. To one, he gave 5 talents. To another, he gave 2, and to another 1, to each according to his ability. That's important, but we'll get back to that. Then he went on a journey. Immediately, the man who had received 5 talents went, put them to work, and earned 5 more. In the same way, the man with 2 earned 2 more, but the man who had received 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. So, he hid his master's money, just buried it in the ground. The master came back from his trip, and the servant who had the 5 talents and had doubled it to make 10 came to him, gave him the 10 talents, and said, "Here you go. Here's your money. This is what I've done with what you gave me." The master said, "Awesome. Good job. Here, you can be in charge of even more stuff. You're a good servant." Then the guy who had 2 and made 4 out of it, he did the same thing. Went up to the master and said, "Here's the 4 talents that are yours. You gave me 2. I made good use of what you gave me." And he was like, "Good job. Well done, my good and faithful servant. I'm going to put you in charge of a lot of stuff now." And then the servant who had the 1 talent, in verse 24, the man who had received 1 talent also approached and said, "Master, I know you. You're a difficult man, reaping where you haven't sown and gathering where you haven't scattered seed. So I was afraid. I was afraid and went off and hid your talent in the ground. Look, you have what is yours." This guy was afraid. And so he hid what God had given him, or his master had given him in this case, but that's the parable. I think maybe sometimes we do the same thing. When Jesus talks about no one takes a lamp and puts it under a bowl, keeping it secret, keeping it safe, I think sometimes maybe we are afraid and maybe we do hide the light that God has given us. Maybe we're afraid that people will think that we're weird. I mean, honestly, maybe we're afraid that we're going to be ostracized at work or with the guys. Maybe we're afraid that we honestly might lose our job. And so we keep it secret, we keep it safe, we keep it hidden, away from everybody else, and stays in the privacy of our own homes, sometimes in the privacy of our own minds, depending on what your household is like. But Jesus continues back in Matthew 5, verse 16. He says, in the same way that a city on a hill lights up the countryside, in the same way that a lamp on its lampstand lights up a house, in the same way let your light shine before men, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. See, Christianity is public. Christianity is public. We're not called to hide the light that God has given us. We're not called to let the salt that he's given us kind of degrade and melt away. We're called to be the light of the world. And Christianity is public. I tell you what, I read this passage and I always ask Martha to review the passage that I'm going to be preaching because she always comes up with really good questions. That's my wife, I should say that. And so she read this, and in verse 16 it says, "Let your light shine before men so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." And she said, now hold on. In the very next chapter, in Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, it says this. Get this. "Be careful," this is Jesus speaking still, "be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of people to be seen by them." Oh, thank you. That's very clear. "Otherwise, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So, whenever you give to the poor, don't sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be applauded by people." To be applauded by people. I think that's key. We'll come back. "I assure you, they've got their reward. But when you give to the poor, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you." Thank you, Jesus. Now I'm all confused. What does this mean? In one chapter, he says, "Let your light shine before men so that they may see your good works." The next chapter, he says, "Do not practice your righteousness in front of people to be seen by them." What do we do with that? And 1 Peter 2:12 says something very similar to Matthew chapter 5. It says, "Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that in a case where they speak against you as those who do what is evil, they will, by observing your good works, glorify God on the day of visitation." They'll glorify God on the day of visitation. So this 1 Peter passage and Matthew chapter 5 passage that are saying, let people see your good works, have got something in common that Matthew chapter 6 does not have. Matthew 5 and 1 Peter talk about pointing to God. Your light, you're the light of the world, your spotlight is shining on God. Versus Matthew chapter 6 talks about to be seen by people, to be applauded by people. And so that's when we take that light and we're shining it on ourselves instead. And that's where, man, how do I know when I'm doing something to get the praise of people versus directing praise to God? So quick example, and I guess as disclaimer, I'm not on Facebook. I haven't been on Facebook in years, so I'm about to say something hard, but I'm not pointing fingers, honestly, at anyone in particular. And if this is you, I think this is something I really want to present as a question, and I want you to struggle with. Okay? I know that maybe even during this time of year, but in general, on Facebook, it's easy for us to do something good where we're at and then share it. And even if it's something like, got to help out a homeless guy, praise God. Okay? Does that direct the spotlight towards God, or does it direct the spotlight towards us? I don't know. But I really want you to struggle with that because I think it's a very fine line, and I think it's very difficult for us to tell our own hearts, honestly, in situations like that. But that's common. And so why do we do that? Why do we feel like it's necessary to share the good things that we're doing? Matthew chapter 5, he says, "Let men see your good deeds and so that they may glorify your Father in heaven." But here's what I think is happening. I think that we're feeling responsible for more than God has given us responsibility for. If you look at the parable of the talents, remember the one servant got 5, the next got 2, the last got 1. They had different spheres of influence, depending on their ability, depending on where God had placed them. Okay? Now, go back to that Matthew 5 passage, and you have the light of the world, the city on the hill, and the lamp on the lampstand that gives light to the entire house. Not the entire neighborhood, not the entire block, just the household. And I think sometimes we are being the light of the world in a small portion, in that small sphere of influence that God has put us in right there. And we feel the pressure to save the entire world, to let the entire world know how good God is. And that's honorable, that's good, but God has given us different spheres of influence, and I don't think we have to be responsible for the entire world. So, if you're on Facebook, struggle with that. Or if you're on Instagram or Snapchat or however you do those things, I don't even know. struggle with that. Are we directing praise to God? Are we shining the spotlight on him, or are we shining it on us? And I don't think I said this yet. This really is the second identification that Jesus gives us. We point. You point. As the light of the world, as the spotlight, you point towards God. See, you are the salt of the earth. You preserve. You are the light of the world. You point. We're preserving the world, keeping it from rotting, and we're pointing them to God in the process. Now, one reason this whole line between are we giving glory to God or giving glory to ourselves, one reason this is so important to me is I had a friend, again, that I worked with down in Sierra Vista, Arizona. I was working at a door company there for a little while. And the guy I worked with, he was a vocal atheist. It's a little bit different. My atheist friend in Joplin, Missouri, in the middle of the Bible Belt, and my atheist friend in southeast Arizona, honestly, it's a little bit different. He was very vocal, and he had two pet peeves that he shared with me one time. And you're going to see, they're kind of funny when put together, but I'm not intending it as a joke. His first pet peeve about churches, about Christians in general, but about churches, is that they're so selfish. They're always wanting to do more for themselves and just to grow their buildings bigger and to make more money and, just to have nicer buildings and stuff. His second pet peeve was that it was how churches are always hyping all the good things that they're doing outside of the walls of the church. Now, I understand, and you probably understand, he was seeing the two exact things and complaining about both of them, and you can't have it both ways. But maybe he was seeing this, where people were pointing the spotlight at themselves rather than at God. Or weren't pointing the spotlight, period. That's why this is so critical. This is why this is so important. We have to be pointers. We have to point towards God and lead people to where they go. And this is my bottom line. Your identity compels engagement. We can't be sitting on the sidelines. See, the reality is you are the salt of the earth. Salt is salty because it's salt, and it preserves because it's salt. Nothing changes that unless water leaches it away and you're left with just the sand that was there. And then it's not salt anymore. Light shines because it's light. That's just the way it is. This is your identity. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. You preserve. You point to God. And this is what you are. This is what you've been called to if you are a follower of Jesus. So how do we do that? How do we point to God? How do we preserve in this world? One thing I want to share with you is actually an idea that comes from a pastor I had back in Joplin when I was going to school there, Joplin, Missouri. And he presented the idea of intersections. And so how do we own this? I want you to remember to pause at the intersections. See, throughout our day, throughout our week, there's so many intersections that we come to in relationships, in conversations at work, going through the checkout line at the grocery store, even just wandering the aisles at Walmart. My wife is good at this. I'll talk her up for a minute because she's not here. She goes to Walmart with my kids. I've got 4 kids, and they're all just so darn cute, Martha included. And she gets stopped by a lady who works there, and they get to talking, and it gives her a hug, and now they hug every time that they see each other. And it's so easy to take an intersection like that and blow on through it because we're so busy and we have things to do and we have groceries to get back in the fridge at home. But what if we pause at those intersections and we take those opportunities to engage? Because our identity compels engagement. We can't just sit on the sidelines. Another common intersection really is at work. Of all of the areas of life, of all of our friendships, of all of our social interactions, work is really the only place where we don't have a choice who we hang out with, right? I mean, throughout the week, if there's any way that we can avoid the people we don't like, we do. But if we're at work, we don't have a choice, right? And so, more often than not, the couple stories I told you where I had interactions with people who were not Christians, it was at work. Work is an intersection in your life, and it's such a critical one because of that, because you're going to see people who probably don't know Jesus, where the rest of the week you may or may not have any interaction with people who don't know Jesus. And so what would it look like to pause at the intersection at work when you're having that conversation with a coworker and they talk about, they just make some offhand comments about hard weekend, dad was in the hospital. Or, I'm concerned about my kid, they've got this test this week, not sure how they'll do. Or concerned about my kid, they're learning to drive, and I'm almost concerned about my car a little bit more, but, But what do you do when you pause and you actually listen to their story and you hear what they're saying? And then you have a chance to take that and you can pray for them by name. And you can pray for their situation by name. How many of you know someone at work who prays for you by name? Cool. Now, what would it be like if the people around you were prayed for by name? Whether they specifically know it or not all the time. But I tell you what you can do. You pause at that intersection. You engage with them by listening to their story the next week. Hey, how's your dad? I was praying for him. I know that he was in the hospital or he had that surgery or whatever. How are things going? That's not weird. That's pretty, who's going to be mad that you were praying for their dad who was in the hospital? Or for their son who had the test and you want to know if they passed. You cared for them. You care for their family. You're investing in that relationship there. And that's just something that's so critical, that's so different than, say, my manager at Sam's Club, who had the idea that he could just kind of bombard my atheist friend at the end of his time there at Sam's Club. Without really knowing him, without really engaging in relationship with him. We are entering the Christmas season, and there's some opportunities here to really be the light of the world, to really be the salt of the earth, to preserve life around us as times get so busy, and it'll be more difficult to pause at the intersections. So one idea that I wanted to share with you guys, kind of a little thing, but kind of a big thing, depending on if you have kids that are expecting a lot of gifts or not, is to take gifts that maybe you were planning to give to someone else. Maybe your kids were planning on getting 6 gifts, maybe they only get 2. Something like that. Just throw that out there. This is the idea. And those gifts get directed to somewhere else, or the money for those gifts get directed somewhere else, and you get to be the light of the world. You get to preserve, maybe. My parents started doing a thing 5 to 10 years ago where they asked us kids to stop giving them physical gifts and instead to build up treasures in heaven for them. And I think this is so cool. I just want everybody to be doing this. And so what we do, instead of getting them gifts, physical gifts, we do something, giving to a certain charity or doing some act of service or something like that in their name, in my mom and dad's name, so that in a sense we're building up treasures in heaven for them, where moth and rust does not destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. Instead of giving them a bunch of junk that's going to wear out and that's going to break and it's going to get all rusty and moth-eaten. That's something that they started that I would encourage any family to start doing, to start building up your treasures in heaven. And that's a way, even during this Christmas season, it's a very direct way to be the light of the world, to be preservers in our world. I'll leave you with one story. My wife's grandma passed away about 2 weeks ago, and she was the last of that generation in her family. And my wife comes from a farm town in Iowa, and basically everything that might conjure up in your head, that's what it was like. Corn and soybeans, her grandma and grandpa, her grandpa farmed, and her dad farms, etc. And there was a lot of things that Martha knew growing up about her grandparents, about how they treated folks in good ways, and how generous they were, different things like that. For instance, she knew that her grandma would take, there's a Highway 6 that runs right in front of their home, and she would see the hobos coming by, and she would invite them in, give them a chore to do, and give them a meal. It's a little thing, but it was effective. Every year they would have a foreign exchange student come and live at their house for the year, who were going to Grinnell College in that town, which is like a real hoity-toity liberal arts school that very few Christians there. That's not what it's about at all. And the students coming from China, from Pakistan, were not Christians at all. But do you really think that living in that household for a year, they didn't catch some glimpse of who these Christians were, of this light of the world? There's some other things, though, that since she passed away, and of course they're going through like old diaries and stuff of her grandma's. And Martha's reading her diaries, which is so cool. I don't know if anybody keeps a diary anymore. But in learning that her grandma was taking meals to people like every single week of her life. She was reading things like took a pie over to Miss whatever's and took a meal over to this family because they were sick, or took a meal over to this family because this person was in the hospital, or they were out of town, or whatever. And Norma Lang was a lady who was the salt of the earth in more ways than one, and was the light of the world in her sphere of influence. See, she didn't have to post this stuff on Facebook. I'm not sure if she even knew if Facebook existed. But she was just taking her lamp on the lampstand, shining light in that house, some occasionally down the street. Maybe God called her to shine the light in the city sometimes. But that's so different of building those relationships. And that's what we're called to do. See, your identity, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Your identity compels you to engage, compels us to engage. We can't sit on the sidelines. This is who we are as Christians. Won't you pray with me? God, I thank you and I praise you for being a God who loves us, a God who has, chosen to engage with us, who you sent your Son to become one of us, to share in the struggles and the sufferings that we have, and to really, and understand everything we go through. And Lord, I pray that you would give us strength and give us courage to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world as you have called us to be, as you have said that we are. Lord, because it's so scary sometimes. I don't want to be thought of as a weirdo or a busybody or anything like that. I really don't. But God, I do want to be effective. I don't want to hide my lamp. I don't want the salt to lose its saltiness. So God, guide us. Give us courage. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.